In 1851, a brave yet foolhardy family of immigrants from Illinois set out on a fateful wagon journey that would end in unimaginable tragedy and launch one of the most gripping survival sagas of America's western expansion. The Oatman clan numbered 9 souls. The Oatman parents, their 7 children aged 15 years to infancy, plus a babe in arms. Propelled by rumors of abundant land and gold in California, Royce Oatman turned a deaf ear to the many dire warnings about traveling through Arizona's desert wasteland. He scoffed at tales of frequent deadly attacks by Apaches and other tribes who viewed immigrants as trespassing invaders. So in the spring of 1851, Oatman pointed his wagon train westward into the Arizona Territory, just one tiny caravan crawling over endless miles of arid nothingness toward an uncertain future in California. I am your desert frontiersman, Alan. If you enjoy this desert tale, please leave a like or comment. For further adventures, hit the subscribe button. It was on the afternoon of March 18th, 1851, on the way to Fort Yuma from Pimole. The attack occurred near the Gila River in what was then the territory of New Mexico, later Arizona territory. That fate at last intervened. Royce spotted a band of Apaches heading straight toward them. Before he could react or arm himself, deafening war cries filled the air as the Indians attacked without warning. Young Lorenzo was clubbed violently and collapsed unconscious into the dirt. His father managed a single errant rifle shot before being swarmed and butchered on the spot. Screaming Mother Mary Ann clutched baby Charles amid the onslaught. The Apaches pillaged all valuables from the wagon before setting it aflame. Then they rounded up Olive and Mary Ann as slaves. The raiders presumed they'd successfully killed all other family members. By the grace of God or simple luck, young Lorenzo Oatman was not dead. Hours later, when the moon rose, Lorenzo awoke disoriented in the dirt. Squinting through swollen eyes at the gory scene surrounding him, memories of the attack flooded his mind. Lorenzo spotted the charred skeleton of their wagon atop a 20-foot bluff and staggered up the embankment. Among scattered corpses, he identified the bodies of his beloved parents and siblings, all except absent Olive and Mary Ann. Half crazed with pain, fearing the attacker's return, Lorenzo fled blindly into the moonlit wasteland. He wandered in futile search of his sisters for some time before discovering the Gila River. Exhausted, he slept fitfully on its muddy shores. After days alone resigned to die in the desert, Lorenzo was shocked by 2 Native Americans riding directly toward him. These men were Pima hunters who meant Lorenzo no harm. Their people maintained generally peaceful relations with white settlers. Too weak to walk, the hunters conveyed the gravely dehydrated, delirious Lorenzo back to the village of Pimole. When he regained strength after days recuperating in Pimole, Lorenzo learned that his 2 sisters' fates remained a mystery. The Pimas told of rumors that Apaches held 2 light-skinned girl captives, but such whispers held more hope than certainty. Nonetheless, Lorenzo became obsessed with rescuing Olive and Mary Ann from the raiders who'd massacred their family. Penniless, orphaned, but sustained by a brother's enduring love, young Lorenzo pleaded in vain for the Pimole villagers to send out armed search parties. With settlers few and scattered across Arizona's frontier, such missions were deemed suicidal amid the ever-present Apache threat. The villagers promised only their prayers and some basic supplies for Lorenzo's travels. His body still healing, Lorenzo set out for Fort Yuma on foot to complete the journey his parents died attempting. Now destitute, he hoped to enlist military aid from the fort to locate and retrieve his captive sisters. At Fort Yuma, the officers heard Lorenzo's story politely enough, but soon dashed his hopes with painful candor. Based on ample past experience with Apache tactics, his sisters would have been brutally raped and murdered their first night, if kept alive that long. The soldiers insisted stale rumors of two surviving white girl captives made no tactical sense and were surely just Indian lies. What use could young girls serve the Apaches? The commander asked. With no skills and unable to bear Apache children, logic meant Olive and Mary Ann must be dead. Lorenzo refused to accept the Army's cold reasoning. But they weren't killed with the others, he insisted. His sisters were out there somewhere, waiting and praying for rescue. Lorenzo swore he'd devote all energy and resources at his disposal to the search, though admittedly meager. Yet Fort Yuma's military community remained unmoved by Lorenzo's stirring testament. They offered provisions to speed him on his journey to California, but refused to dispatch soldiers on what officers deemed a fool's errand into the Badlands. Lorenzo did spark sympathy and outrage from miners, frontiersmen, and settlers who came through Yuma and heard his tragic tale. In campfire circles crackling with curiosity, Lorenzo repeated his saga night after night. At one such gathering about 4 weeks later, the tale galvanized a gang of 9 hardened miners into action. That night, the men voted unanimously to mount a volunteer rescue posse to seek the Oatman girls, raid the Apaches, and punish them for their butchery. Come sunrise, though, Fort Yuma's commander declared no such vigilante party could be sanctioned on a mission he continued insisting was almost certainly futile. The miners reluctantly disbanded. A warm-hearted doctor named Hewitt befriended young Lorenzo for a while, but urgent family matters soon forced the doctor to depart alone east. Yet again abandoned but unbroken, our brave young protagonist took to the frontier trails in pursuit of his kidnapped sisters. By late 1853, over 2 years had passed since his family's massacre. Lorenzo realized his best chances of mounting a rescue lay in a big city, where wealthy men with resources might take up his cause. So he set his sights on San Francisco, sprawling boomtown gateway for adventurers from across the globe flocking to California's gold rush. But the bright lights and big city soon proved all glitter and no gold for young Oatman. Securing employment was no trouble for the strapping farm lad, but the non-stop hustle for cash left San Francisco's masses no time for sympathy. Lorenzo's tragic tale elicited only chuckles and drinks one night from a crowd of off-duty miners. Crushed, feeling a stranger in a strange land, Lorenzo wrote San Francisco off as a dead end. He drifted south digging for gold himself. By October 1854, Lorenzo had journeyed southwest to Los Angeles, where whisperings hinted Apache raiders held light-skinned captives. Here at last he encountered signs his efforts were having impact. Over years his tragic story had spread gradually across the frontier, even reaching East Coast newspapers. The 18-year-old Lorenzo now cut an imposing figure, thick-necked and broad-shouldered. His tale commanded attention, evoking community outrage. Yet confirming Olive and Mary Ann's fates remained maddeningly elusive. Some travelers reported Apaches claimed no white captives at all, while others repeated the stale rumor that one surviving girl remained hostage somewhere north. With confusion and distance from the kidnapping now spanning 3 years, Lorenzo's various sources grew increasingly suspect. Meanwhile, in Arizona's wild borderlands, the Oatman saga evolved over years of retelling into fireside legend. Whichever version one believed, all shared conviction the lost girls must certainly be dead after years among the Apaches. Lorenzo Oatman simply refused to quit. Our tireless hero crisscrossed the Southwest multiple times, trekking desert paths alone for hundreds of miles seeking tribal villages, constantly inquiring about his sisters. He joined surveying groups when opportunity arose. Lorenzo drifted into the patterns of a haunted drifter, taking dangerous jobs, trading seasonal labor for bunk and board wherever he paused his ongoing quest. At remote campsites, Lorenzo repeatedly told his tale, hoping to gather useful clues. But the next day always found the stranger saddling up solitary again upon another empty trail. By 1856, 5 years after the massacre, the 20-year-old Lorenzo arrived in Yuma, depressed and world-weary. But fortune finally delivered a slender ray of light. An old letter given to Lorenzo contained recent second-hand report from a bush trader named Rowlett, who claimed to have personally met and spoken with Olive. Rowlett vouched a teenage Olive was indeed alive just months earlier, somehow still surviving amid northern Arizona's Mojave tribe after they had traded her from the Apaches. This electrifying update vaulted new energy into Lorenzo's wilting hopes of finally bringing his sweet sister Olive home. He hastily retraced his route northward toward the forlorn heart of Apache country, pushing himself to utter exhaustion. Lorenzo aimed to intercept friendly tribal leaders, hoping they could serve as intermediaries with the notoriously hostile Mojaves and their Apache cousins. The most direct route led straight through the domain of those volatile hostiles Lorenzo desperately hoped to avoid confrontation with. Yet he forged ahead heedless of danger, propelled by newfound faith that beloved Olive still drew breath somewhere ahead. If he could just slip into her captor's camp at night, his stealth and sheer nerve might suffice to sneak Olive to freedom. But Lorenzo's brazen rescue scheme was not meant to be. Barely 1 week into Mojave country, he was spotted and pursued by 3 Native American sentries. A brief exchange of gunfire before Oatman fled on foot into rocky terrain. He scrambled without stopping for hours, up crumbly arroyos and through spiny brush. Finally, after nightfall, Lorenzo stumbled upon the flooded Colorado River. With no chance of escape on open ground, Lorenzo plunged desperately into the powerful currents, clinging to a thick tree branch to avoid being swept under or dashed on rocks. Days later, Lorenzo returned to Yuma feverish and defeated. Though grateful to be alive, despair now fully smothered all hope of rescuing beloved Olive. His daring solo raid had failed utterly. Without money for paying ransom fees or enlisting experienced Indian fighters, realistic chances for success dwindled to nothing. Our crestfallen hero now faced the grim certainty that Olive must remain captive forever, or had likely long since gone to her reward. Perhaps it was time at last for this lone Oatman survivor to lay the past to rest. Thus mired in black sorrow, Lorenzo wandered brokenly west through Arizona and California, and ended up in the town of Monte. Prospects seemed empty for fulfilling relationships or purposeful life of his own. Then, in the sleepy desert town of Yuma, where his crusade began 5 years earlier, sensational news exploded one February 1856 morning to jolt Lorenzo out of his gloomy abyss. A friend galloped up waving a Los Angeles newspaper and pointing excitedly to banner headlines reading, "An American woman rescued from the Indians." In terse words, the report confirmed beyond wildest dreams that his sister Olive was alive after 4 years of captivity and back safe at Fort Yuma. Lorenzo collapsed, shuddering into the dirt, overcome with release of grief long buried. Lorenzo regained enough composure to travel urgently west the 200 miles to reunite with dear Olive. The dramatic cannon booms and ringing hoorays that accompanied her rescue delivery were described as deafening. Olive arrived escorted by a Yuma Native American named Francisco, seeking promised payment for the lost woman. Her clothing tattered and skin leathery with crude tattoos from mutilating tribal rituals, the fully grown Olive was zombie-like amid the chaotic celebration. Quivering from trauma and malnutrition, her haunted eyes scanned the cheering mob without comprehending. It was a kindly stranger named Grinnell who first greeted Lorenzo days later upon his arrival, providing long-awaited account of Olive's providential rescue. 4 years after the massacre, Grinnell confirmed young Mary Ann had perished. But rumors persisted of the surviving Olive, somehow enduring abuse from the Mojaves after being traded from the Apaches. So Grinnell tirelessly negotiated with all local tribes, personally offering reward for Olive's return, not in dollars but practical barter of livestock, food, and blankets. And one day his righteousness paid dividends. Francisco arrived at Fort Yuma after an extraordinary 400-mile round-trip journey on foot into dangerous Mojave land. He had ventured alone to face Olive's skeptical captors with his promised bounty, out-bargaining the Mojaves to let the woman return home with him. As for details of the highly emotional reunion between Olive and her devoted brother Lorenzo, the earnest witnesses present described it as almost mystical in poignancy. Upon seeing Lorenzo, Olive rushed forth, but the shock of reconciliation was too intense for words. For long moments the siblings fell trembling into tearful embrace, able only to weep openly as they clung together once more. Lorenzo stroked Olive's hair and tattooed face, assuring his sweet sister her horrific trials were finished. Never again would she spend a night in bondage. In days to follow, Olive haltingly recounted her 4 years of captivity since the massacre. Some months after the wagon attack, she was indeed traded by Apaches to the Mojaves for some trinkets. But her frail sibling had not survived the brutality of captivity long. Little Mary Ann had previously perished, unable to endure the chronic abuse and starvation. And now at last, she was in Lorenzo's strong arms again. Though her spirit had been crushed long ago and beauty stolen, the Oatman family nightmare had come full circle. First, they lived 6 months in Oregon off money from the book written about her captivity. She still was not doing well, so Lorenzo hoped to gradually heal Olive by bringing her back east, far from these haunted southwestern lands. Olive's slipping sanity was evident. Episodes of madness tortured her waking hours with violent flashbacks of Indian outrages, episodes that grew worse with time. Emotionally broken long before her unlikely rescue, by 1858 Olive had utterly ceased to function, overcome by traumatic melancholy that would not release its demonic grip. Within 2 years of walking free once more, Olive Oatman died insane, her tormented soul finally extinguished. The tale of how the Oatmans courageously struggled and their terrible fate out west riveted newspaper readers nationwide following the original massacre. Twice widowed by tragedy, poor Lorenzo laid his only sibling Olive to rest, unable to protect her tormented mind. With the last of his kindred gone, the lone Oatman survivor faded into obscure frontier history. So concluded the extraordinary Oatman Odyssey, which touched the extremes of human cruelty and compassion on the American frontier. Thanks to one good Samaritan's perseverance and a heroic Yuma tribesman, Lorenzo's hope was briefly revived when Olive improbably returned from 5 years' captivity. But her second tragic death was no less devastating. Yet the story remains intact of how, against all odds, a lost daughter of Arizona endured half a decade of slavery and surfaced sane enough to walk again on free soil into her brother's arms. Thank you for joining me on this Southwest journey. Please leave a like or comment. Hit the subscribe button for more desert romps. Happy trails.